All right, everybody, welcome back. Let's get right to it. Kansas City Chiefs 2019. I want to focus on today how much cap space they have. Where does exactly all that money go when you have $190 million to spend? Where can you find the wiggle room, and what would you like to do with it if you can find a little bit of flexibility in that cap number? We'll start with this right here, $26 million. That's your working number. If you're a Kansas City Chiefs fan, this is the number that you want to look at, $26 million. It's how much cap space you have right now at the moment. That number is going to fluctuate, go up and down, mostly up all off season till you get back to $190 million. All of these numbers that you're going to see here, they're all going to change during the next couple of months. During the month of March, it'll be hard to make a video that isn't obsolete in about 2 days because the numbers just change so fast. But for now, $26 million before you do much of anything else is how much money you have to spend on either your own players or players that are coming in on the draft or free agency. $6.6 million. Let's get into that $190 million circle, that sphere that you have to spend as a team. $6.6 million of it, roughly, will be spent on your draft picks that are coming in. You got a first, you got a couple of seconds, then you got a third, and a couple of picks after that. Put it all together for this season, that's going to cost you about $6.6 million. You might say, well, does that need to come out of the $26 million? It doesn't, for this reason. When you get down here, you have 37 players right now, roughly 37 players, who are making $37.1 million total. That's an average, easy math, of $1 million each. For the most part, these players here, you're going to lose about 6 of those players at $1 million each. You're going to pick up your draft picks, about $6.6 million. So this number here will basically come out of that number right there. Speaking of these players right here, 37 players at $37 million. That's pretty standard for an NFL team. This is where your special teamers live. This is the poor class of the NFL. This is where your mainly non-starters live for the most part. Some of these guys have to start, but this is where all of your backups live for the most part. On average, they make $1 million each. A lot of those guys are stuck down at the league minimum of about $600,000 a year. That's where a lot of these guys, even guys who don't hardly ever see the playing field, this is where they live. This is also where some of your guys who are making about $1.5 million on rookie contracts live as well, undrafted free agents, things of that nature. This is by far the largest percentage of players in the NFL. More players live right here in this category than down in the rich neighborhoods. So when you hear about the guys making hundreds of millions of dollars, and some of them do, or the tens of millions of dollars in the NFL, it's not most of the NFL. Most of them live right here in this area. You can't get away from this number. You can't get players any cheaper than this. This is the bottom of the NFL. You're going to have about 35 to 40 players who are making, on average, $1 million each. So that $37 million, even though the 6.6 is going to come out of that, you can't get away from spending that. You have to spend that $37 million. So that's not going to change hardly at all. Move to the NFL's middle class. For the Kansas City Chiefs, that's 6 players who combined this season will hit about $23 million. That's an average of about just under $4 million each. This is where usually in the NFL, your backup quarterback will live in this area, your punter, your kicker, a couple of other minimal margin starters, guys like Daniel Sorensen, who, man, you really wish probably weren't starting, but you can bring him in off the bench. You can find a little bit of wiggle room here. And here's where you have to be careful. You can cut guys like Daniel Sorensen or your backup quarterback, Chad Henne, if you feel like, man, he's not worth it anyway. You can cut guys like that, but invariably what that means is one of these guys is going to get more playing time. And that often means the guy you drafted in the 5th round last year, or the guy you drafted in the 4th round 2 years ago. And sometimes they're ready, and sometimes they aren't. But invariably, when you start trying to cut players right here in this area, you are really tapping into your depth of these other guys who probably, for the most part, shouldn't be starting. You've already got a lot of them starting anyway. Guys on rookie deals like Chris Jones, Tyreek Hill, of course, stars. But this is where a lot of other guys are coming from who are already starting, and you're really taxing the depth of your late round drafting when you do this, when you're cutting players here. So you can find, yes, you can find a little bit of wiggle room right here in these 6 players, $23 million. You can save a couple of $1 million here and there. Maybe put together a $4 or $5 million if there's something you're really wanting to do with that. But you're really starting to mess around with your depth. So I don't generally advise making heavy cuts in that area. This is the rich neighborhood of the NFL. for the Kansas City Chiefs, there are 8 players who put together are making just over $100 million. That averages out to about $12.5 million per player. This is your 2 tackles, Schwartz and Fisher. This is Eric Berry. This is Justin Houston. This is Sammy Watkins. These are the guys, Travis Kelce. This is where you're going to have your wiggle room at. Now, for the Kansas City Chiefs, the problem is, the dilemma is, for the most part, these 8 players, they are either guys like Schwartz and Kelce that you would never dream of cutting because their contracts are so good, and they are so good, or it's guys like Fisher or Sammy Watkins or Justin Houston or Eric Berry, who, not Justin Houston, but these guys who you might want to cut, but you can't cut them this year because the dead cap hit is so high. So for this year, this particular offseason, the Kansas City Chiefs, there is not much wiggle room in these 8 players. The dead cap hits are so tough on the players that you might think about letting go. You just don't have the room. There is one player, it's Justin Houston, we'll get to him later, that you do have a good bit of wiggle room with, and this is going to be really where your cap flex comes from this offseason for the Kansas City Chiefs. But for a lot of NFL teams, this is where you find the wiggle room at. You cut one of these players, you cut a couple of these players, and then you use that money to go sign other players that you want. This is what you have right here, $26 million. You're going to have a little bit of wiggle room. I want to look at the Kansas City Chiefs' heavy decisions. The first one for this offseason is Dee Ford. This is the big one, and for this reason, it's the one that you have to act on right now. Are there other big decisions even involving even better players? Yes, but Dee Ford is the one whose contract is up, his 5th-year option is gone. You have to make a decision on Dee Ford, and I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. You guys are already looking at the board. This is what is going around everywhere from the media. Brett Veach even already mentioned that he wanted to have Dee Ford back. So I'm not coming up with anything original here. The standard thing for Dee Ford looks like he's going to be getting the franchise tag. Now, if he were to hit free agency, this is what I think he could get. 5 years, $70 million. When I look at the off seasons, the free agency for the past 2 off seasons, what the edge rushers are getting, I think Dee Ford can pretty easily get a 5-year, $70 million deal. I'm not going to pay him that. Now, a lot of you say, why not? Why not go ahead and pay Dee Ford, get it taken care of, get it moved off the books? Maybe he'll even give you a discount because it's your home team and he'd rather be with you. He's already said he'd rather be with you. Why not go ahead and see if he'll give you a discount, and maybe you can get him for 4 years, $60 million or something of that ilk. Here's the problem with Dee Ford. A lot of you already know this because you're Chiefs fans and you follow it. Dee Ford had an amazing year last year, but the 4 seasons before that, 4 seasons were largely unproductive. They were injury-riddled. Even when Dee Ford hit the field, they were largely unproductive. He did not grade out well in any of those 4 seasons. Even the one season where he showed a lot of pressure on the quarterback and even racked up, I think it was 10 sacks in 1 year. I think his second year, he was not playing well in other areas of his game. He really had a lot to prove. Never proved it for the first 4 seasons. As I mentioned before, at this time last year, a lot of Chiefs fans were like, gee whiz, I wish we hadn't picked up his 5th-year option. I wish we could have just let him go. And now all of a sudden he explodes. He has a career year. This is not unusual. This is normal in the NFL for you to see guys right before they're about to hit free agency have a career year, and right after they get done with free agency and they get the big contract, their numbers dip back down. My feeling on Dee Ford is this, that he's never going to be as bad as he was during his first 4 seasons. Again, I think he's past that, but I also have a real feeling that you're not going to see the dominant Dee Ford that you saw this year for the Kansas City Chiefs. Don't forget, he was playing alongside Justin Houston. He was playing alongside Chris Jones. It was very difficult for defenses to focus exclusively on Dee Ford this year because he had 2 other pass rushers who were elite pass rushers, basically, taking a lot of pressure off of Ford. He's facing a lot of one-on-ones. If Dee Ford gets put on a team where he is the only pass rusher or where he's the best pass rusher, he is going to face double and triple teams constantly, and because of that, you're going to see the numbers go down. So I think he's going to end up being somewhere between the player he was last year and the player he was during his first 4 seasons, and I don't want to pay 5 years, $70 million for that. I don't want to pay 5 years, $60 million for that. It's not a knock on Dee Ford. It's just called I want to win Super Bowls. Now, the common sense thing seems to be here, the franchise tag, and that's going to cost you about $16.5 million, roughly $16.5 million to put the franchise tag on Dee Ford. Now, that's going to come out of $26 million. That leaves you roughly $10 million. So that's a big hit when you've only got $26 million of cap space to work with in the first place, which is fine. That's enough money. But you having to franchise Dee Ford, that's a lot of money coming out. That leaves you with only about $10 million. So, yes, I think the safe bet, franchise Dee Ford, and listen, you're hearing this all over the place. This isn't just from me. Franchise Dee Ford, see if for a second season in a row he can produce at that same high level, and find out if this is somebody you really want to invest in long term. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but this buys you another season to see and find out. It's an expensive season, but I think it's worth it for you to find out if Dee Ford is really ready to be an elite player or if he's just ready to be a solid starter in this league. Now, so my opinion is you franchise Dee Ford, and that cuts this number down to about $10 million. Let's get to Steve Nelson. I'm going to talk about Steve Nelson and Orlando Scandrick at the same time. A lot of you said, hey, we should be keeping Nelson, and all over all the boards, everywhere you're seeing we should let Orlando Scandrick go. I need to point this out. Orlando Scandrick, Steve Nelson. Steve Nelson is younger by several seasons, and he played better than Scandrick last year, but not drastically better. The difference in play last year between those two players was marginal. Nelson was the better player. That was distinct and obvious, but Scandrick did not play bad. And when you look at their overall games and their overall grades, at this point in their careers, and granted, Scandrick is going down because of age, Nelson in theory should be going up because of age, but last year on the field, their performance was relatively close, with Nelson coming out being the better player, especially at the end of the season. The problem is for Nelson, you are going to have to pay money to keep him. If you keep Scandrick, and listen, the Scandrick decision is not a money decision. He'll come in at under $2 million, which is what he was last year. If he plays solid like he did last year, he played solid, then it's worth the money. But that's really a football decision, and that's an Andy Reid decision. And this is where I'm going to listen hard and heavy to Andy Reid, because Andy Reid knows who the leaders are in the locker room, and I have no clue if Scandrick is one of those guys or not, who really sets the tone for the younger guys, really shows them how to work, or maybe he doesn't. I don't know that. That's up to Andy Reid to tell me, and I'll decide if I want to bring Scandrick back or not. So that's the reason that you're looking at Scandrick and Nelson in two different ways. Nelson, even though he's younger and you would think would get better, is going to cost you a lot of money. I think if he hits free agent market, and this is based on what we're seeing from the last couple of all seasons, I think Nelson makes four years, $30 million. He's not a great cornerback. In my opinion, he's a marginally starting cornerback. He's part of a very large group, what I would call the fourth tier of cornerbacks. It's a very large group of about 40 cornerbacks in the NFL who you do not feel great about starting, but you'll start them at that second cornerback spot if you have to, and you'll feel decent about that. Problem is, because the cornerbacks in free agency this year, it looks like a very shrunken, small cornerback class. There's going to be a lot of money thrown around for guys who, quite frankly, aren't worth it. Steve Nelson, I think, based on this point in time, can make 4 years, $30 million. I'm not even going to think about paying that. I am going to make an offer. Here's the offer. It's going to be 4 years, $18 million. That's about $4.5 million a season. And that's where I set my value for Steve Nelson to come back to the Kansas City Chiefs. Would I like to have him? Yes. I'm only going to guarantee about $18 million, about $10 million of that, because that's all I want to guarantee for him coming back. If he comes back and starts playing worse than I've got him from one season, I can cut him in year 2, and the dead cap hit would be very small, probably about $2 or $3 million during that second season. But I would like to bring him back. His age dictates that. The way he has played solid for the past couple of seasons dictates that. I would be interested in bringing Steve Nelson back, but only 4 years, $18 million. And basically, I think his agent is going to laugh in my face. I think he'll take that number back to Steve Nelson, and Steve Nelson is going to laugh about it, and Steve Nelson is going to hit free agency. I'm not going to take that personally. I'm going to say thank you. Appreciate you playing for the team. Hope you do well in free agency, and I think you will. I think you can get that 4-year 30. I am not even going to consider paying 4 years, $30 million for Steve Nelson. I really am not even sure I want to pay this 4 years, 18, but I would like to have him back, considering that my cornerbacks are just not particularly good, and it's hard to go out in free agency and get another one that doesn't cost me a ton of money. All right, so that's Steve Nelson. If I do bring him back at $4.5 million, then this cap space is basically gone. And this is where you really have to start digging in and making decisions. We looked at where all the money goes. We looked at how much cap space we have. If I sign Dee Ford to a franchise tag, that's $16 million. That leaves me with 10. If I sign Steve Nelson, which I don't think he'll do, I think he's going to laugh and walk. If I do sign Steve Nelson at $4.5 million a season, that's going to leave me with about $5 million in cap space, which I'm going to have in order to lock up some of these other players that are heading out on free agency as well, guys that are marginal players. We're not going to talk a lot about them today, but we're going to need that $5 million as a little bit of flexibility. So basically, your cap space is gone after you sign Ford and Nelson. Now, let's assume that I think Nelson walks. That gets you back to $10 million that you still have. Let's go to Mitch Morse. I made a mistake on my last video. I threw in the free agency decisions just as a bonus on my last video, and that was the weakest part of my video, and a number of you who are rather intellectual called me out on it. And the biggest weakness of that part of the free agency bonus that I tossed in is right here, Mitch Morse. I've had, I think, 3 different ones of you, Charlie being one, a couple other guys who questioned this and pointed out a number of reasons why Mitch Morse is not, he's the center, he is not going to be back for the Kansas City Chiefs this offseason. Here's number 1, is that typically, and this comes from Charlie, Andy Reid, and I went back and looked this up, for the past 8 years that Andy Reid has been in charge of the Chiefs and then the Eagles for a couple of seasons, he does not pay money on middle linemen. That's your 2 guards or your center. He just doesn't pay much money. I think $2 or $3 million is the most he ever laid out. Mitch Morse, if he hits free agency, is probably looking at a deal for about 4 years and $36 million, an average of about $8 or $9 million a year, depending on how the free agency works out. He's going to be one of the better centers available this offseason. The Chiefs are simply not going to pay that. They just aren't, based on this heavy a price tag. They don't have the cap space anyway. And in addition, we don't know how good Austin Reeder is, but when he has hit the field, what few times he has hit the field, he has looked solid, he has looked decent, he hasn't looked horrible. He's looked somewhere in the neighborhood of what Mitch Morse has looked at, but Morse has just gotten a lot more playing time. So I don't put a lot of stock in Austin Reeder necessarily being able to step up and do what Mitch Morse is doing, but Austin Reeder is going to be about $8 million a year cheaper. So based on what a number of you guys are telling me, and when I went back and did my own homework on this, Mitch Morse, I'm not going to be able to afford him, and because of that, I'm going to let him pass. I'm not even going to make an offer to Morse. He is that far up above what I think I can pay for, and what I think the Chiefs are going to do anyway. Like you pointed out, Andy Reid does not pay for those middle interior linemen. So Mitch Morse is going to walk. I don't have to worry about him in this cap space. So I still, in theory, I franchised Ford, I watched Nelson walk away from me, and I let Morse, I'm letting Morse go. So I still have $10 million in cap space. That's not much. I really can't spend all of that in free agency. I really can only spend about 6 or 7 of that in free agency. If I decide to let go of a Daniel Sorensen or a Chad Henne or something of that nature, I might can squeeze up and push to $10 million in free agency. That's still not a lot. And so here's where your decision really comes in. Do I keep Justin Houston? Justin Houston is making $21 million this season. He's making $19 million next offseason. Do I keep him, or do I trade him away, get whatever I can for him? Listen, his value will never be higher than it is right now. Justin Houston's value as a player will never be higher than it is right now. He had a good season last year. He was one of the best edge rushers in the NFL, not the elite, but he was very good as an edge rusher. His cap number is going to limit some of the offers you'll get. That $20 million, that's a hefty cap number, but it's only going to cost me $7 million of dead cap space to let him go right now if I trade him. I don't think I can get a first rounder for Justin Houston, I don't think, but with people like the Broncos offering 4th round draft picks for a 34-year-old quarterback, you never know. I think for Justin Houston, I might can get a 2nd round draft pick, because there are a lot of teams who would really love to have a pass rusher who can do what he can do. They keep him for 2 seasons, even though the cap number is high. I think, and I don't know this, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, I think I can get a 2nd round draft pick for Justin Houston, and I would love to have that, even if that draft pick isn't until next offseason. I would love to have that. And we're going to let Justin Houston go. We're going to trade him away. That's going to save $14 million. That's going to get me up to around $22, $23, maybe $24 million that I can go to free agency with. I am not going to get deep into free agency right now, but I will say this. I would prefer this route. I would prefer to trade Justin Houston right now. That still leaves me with Chris Jones. That still leaves me with Dee Ford as pass rushers this year. You might say, well, we would love to have Houston stay with us. We'd love to just restructure his contract. We'd love to have him retire as a Chief. The problem is you're not going to win Super Bowls that way. We're just not in an era right now where you can keep these players, even the players that you love, even players that are performing pretty well. You just can't keep them and compete for Super Bowls. And if I'm the Kansas City Chiefs, and I have Andy Reid, and I have Patrick Mahomes, and I went toe-to-toe with the Patriots last year in the AFC title game, and I basically lost because I didn't get the ball in overtime, basically, and because I couldn't stop Tom Brady, I am not going to tie myself to a lot of players who are going to make it more difficult for me to get to the Super Bowl. Even if I like those players, even if they're still performing pretty well, don't forget Justin Houston's previous 2 seasons were not great seasons. They were solid. This was another outstanding year for him. His trade value will not get any higher, so I think you can get a second-round draft pick for him. Even if you can't, I'm still going to look at trading him, maybe a 3 and a 6, depending on what all people are willing to offer. I'm going to say $14 million. Don't forget, next off-season, this is huge, next off-season, that saves me $19 million as well that I can go around and play with. On top of that, I think this is the route you need to go. You still have 2 edge rushers. I would rather take that money, that $14 million plus what you have left there, so you're looking at $22, $23 million. I would much rather take that into free agency, and I would really like to sign another safety. Now, I know that this is where I'm going to part ways with a lot of you. When you look at what is probably going to be available in free agency this year at the cornerback spot, which is your #1 position of need if you're the Kansas City Chiefs, by far it is your #1 position of need. There's just not going to be much available, it doesn't look like. You're very limited. Those few guys that are available are going to cost out the hilt. It's just going to be outrageous. I am not going to overpay for cornerback this offseason. Last offseason, the cornerback depth was a lot deeper in free agency. That would have really been the year last year to try to go out and get a cornerback in free agency. The Chiefs elected not to do that. Maybe next offseason you can address that. You cannot address every position of need in every offseason. You're always going to have holes. So I'm going to hit free agency for a safety this year. When you look at the safeties this offseason, it's a lot deeper list. I'm not going to go after the top guys, but there are a couple of safeties, and we'll probably hit this in a future video. There's a couple of safeties that I would love to try to see get over to the Chiefs, at least one of them. They're more affordable, not only because the safeties are deeper this year in free agency, but because safeties generally are cheaper. And Spagnuolo, listen, even if Eric Berry comes back healthy, I would still love to have another safety playing alongside of him. Even if I decide to keep Daniel Sorensen, that puts Daniel Sorensen at that experienced backup role, which I think he's perfect for, and at $4.5 million a year, I'm more than happy to pay that. So for the Chiefs, I would love to see them go out and get one of the safeties in free agency, maybe the 3rd or 4th guy. There's a pretty deep list right now, and you never know who's going to keep who, which teams are going to keep those safeties. But it looks like it's projecting it's going to be a solid safety class this year. Safeties generally don't cost as much. You have that money. I would spend that money on a safety this year, and then I would go and I would look at a middle linebacker. I am not going to go out and pay big money for a linebacker. I know a lot of people are recommending that right now, but you have guys on the team that you're hoping get better under Steve Spagnuolo. With Dorian O'Daniel at the outside linebacker spot, you're hoping Anthony Hitchens looks a lot better in this new scheme. You've already paid a lot of money for Anthony Hitchens. You need to give him a chance to let that happen. But what I would like to see is maybe go out and get a veteran linebacker at about $4 or $5 million a season for maybe 2 seasons. A guy who really knows how to play hard, even if he's past his prime, because you're not going to be able to afford a top linebacker. Even if he's past his prime, you get a guy in who's a veteran, who really believes in stopping the run, who's a smart, cagey guy. Maybe he's lost a step or 2. He is not the elite player he used to be by any stretch. I would really love to see the Chiefs do that. So that's what I would like to see here. We'll go back over it again one more time and then I'm done. Franchise, Dee Ford, offer to Steve Nelson, but I think he's going to walk. I'm going to pass on Mitch Morse. I'm going to trade Justin Houston if I can get something of good value out of him. I'm going to have about I'm going to have about $23 million. I'm going to use that money in free agency to get one of the safeties who I think is really going to help the team out in the secondary. And then I'm also going to go and get a linebacker, somebody who is very tough and very veteran. The money just runs out at a certain point. You can't cover all the holes. Some of these things you can cover in the draft. Some of these things you can't cover in the draft. It just depends on what all's there. So as far as the money side goes, though, this is what we're looking at. All right, thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you next time. Have a great day. Bye.